Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. And I'm delighted to be joined by Ben Simpfendorfer, Asia Pacific lead for the Oliver Wyman Forum, obviously of the Oliver Wyman Company. Ben, who is well known to all audiences in the Middle East and across Asia, is of course the former CEO of Silk Road Associates. Ben was worked in Asia and the Middle East for 25 years. I think he's one of the few people I know who speaks both Mandarin and Arabic, and former chief China economist at the RBS. And the resume just goes on and on. There is no one better to talk about the bridge of trade that connects Europe, or Middle East and Asia than Ben Simpfendorfer. So Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Good to see you again. Sure.
We're triggering this conversation. I mean, I grab any opportunity to have a chat with you, but this one triggered by the publishing of your new report, The New Silk Road, Growth, Connection and Opportunity, which you recently published with your colleague Adel Al-Falasi. And what drew my attention, I mean, amongst many things in the headlines of nonetheless, that trade between the Middle East and Asia has grown tenfold in the last 20 years. But you most notably point out that something significant has happened in the last 2 years, the sort of post-COVID window. Let's start there. What's happened in the last 2 years that has really underpinned this relationship between the Gulf particularly and Asia, but China particularly on that side?
It's definitely a good place to start. The last 2 years has been game-changing. It has marked a sharp departure from the more traditional trade in oil for consumer goods we've seen over the last 20 years. So what has been driving that change? Three key factors. The first, of course, is geopolitics. And there is an element of de-risking going on globally, but also regionalization in Asia and the Middle East as partners within our region increasingly look out to each other as sources of investment, but also sources of capital, talent, and technology. At the second is the post-oil energy transition. The Middle East, or the GCC in particular, as it looks to develop its non-oil sectors, such as through Saudi Arabia's plan, Vision 2030, or others similar plans, that in turn is increasing demand for non-oil goods and services. The Asia region, of course, is a significant supplier of these. And then the third, of course, is a supply chain disruption. So we are beginning to see the shift of manufacturing around the region, factories in part moving out of China into Southeast Asia, South Asia. The Middle East, of course, has a role to play here, either as a destination for that investment in countries such as Egypt or Morocco, or an investor into the ancillary services such as shipping or aviation that supports the movements in those supply chains.
Well, let's just grab onto that first point you made, de-risking in terms of geopolitics. Is that de-risking the Gulf, the Middle East, away from its traditional geopolitical allies in the West, or is it de-risking from the Middle East sort of spreading its ways, including India, but China, but others, Indonesia? Where is the de-risking that you refer to?
So Chinese companies in particular recognize that their more traditional markets, especially in the United States, are perhaps a little bit more difficult to access than in the past, not least because of growing trade tensions between the two countries. And so many of the entrepreneurs or private companies in particular are looking for opportunities elsewhere. The Middle East, of course, is a very large and growing market, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular. So it's perhaps less about de-risking and more about a rebalancing of their portfolios to markets where there aren't the same constraints on the activities of Chinese firms in particular.
What about the other direction? I mean, obviously you could see China looking for new markets, but what about the de-risking from the point of view of the likes of Saudi and a lot of the oil producers here in the Gulf, in which they sort of put all their eggs in the China oil demand basket? Is there any de-risking there?
So again, it's more a question of rebalancing of portfolios or catch-up. So the Middle East, of course, the GCC in particular, has invested heavily into Europe and the United States over the past few years. And that makes a good deal of sense. These are mature markets, well-regulated markets where there's significant financial opportunities. But it means that China and Asia are underweight in the portfolios of many Middle East sovereign wealth funds or companies. And so there's a rebound process taking place there, which ultimately means more investment from the Middle East into the Asia region.
I mean, one of the things that this big sort of new Silk Road, to use the phrase, and a phrase you have been famously quoted for many years since your book in 2009, the physicality of that road in the new sort of modern era has been what is the Belt Road Initiative of the Chinese government. The current president is the principal author of, which is essentially building a physical connectivity of trade between China and the Middle East and every place in between. What is the state and health of that? There's been a lot of somewhat negative coverage of that in recent years, that it didn't really work, that it's cost a lot of money and is kind of been pushed to the background as a principal pillar of the trade architecture across the New Silk Road for Asia, Middle East. Your sort of current synopsis of that Belt Road Initiative.
So the Belt and Road Initiative is constantly evolving. It looks very different to how it looked 5 years ago, and very different again to its appearance 10 years ago. And there's a reason for that. Chinese corporates are constantly evolving themselves, shifting their strategy in response to either some successes or some failures in the market. So where are we today? We've really begun to move to a degree away from the big infrastructure projects, where perhaps there's less appetite than there was before. Clearly, sort of sovereign debt levels are higher than they were pre-pandemic. At the same time, many Chinese companies are finding more opportunity in non-infrastructure sectors, especially technology sectors. And so they're beginning to pivot into those sectors. Also supply chain related sectors, not just manufacturing, but of course the supporting services. Again, everything from ports to aviation are all opportunities for Chinese companies. And so that evolution is particularly pronounced in Southeast Asia, but it's also evident in the Middle East itself.
I noticed in your report and in your comments earlier, Ben, you sort of highlighted that the trade relationship between Asia and the Middle East, and China in particular, and the Middle East, the principal markets here, has moved beyond energy and now also capital, technology, talent. I mean, I was at the big event in Oman recently, and the annual Oman Energy Exhibition and Conference, and nearly a quarter of the hall was Chinese oil supply service companies. But for a long time, there's been a view that technology couldn't compete in this market with the likes of Halliburton and Schlumberger and the sort of household names who have led in the supply chain services area of the principal industry of the Middle East, of the Gulf. Has that changed? You've obviously referenced it, technology coming out of China in the oil and gas supply services industry.
So it is changing. And certainly my conversations in that industry is that Chinese technologies increasingly are recognized as a viable alternative, in some cases, world class. So there is movement in that market. Of course, it depends on the sector and the product you're talking about. But again, what it does is to echo that there has been a shift away from physical infrastructure into less tangible goods, more advanced technologies. And that's where the focus again will be over the next 5 or 10 years or so. That's not to say Chinese companies are still very active building infrastructure, but there has been that constant evolution. Equally, we've spoken about technology, but clean energy is another area where there is significant opportunities. China is the world's largest producer across a range of clean energy goods, anything from solar panels to electrolyzers, as well as the refining of many critical minerals. So again, this is a sector where Chinese companies, private and state, are evolving into in order to catch new opportunities. It really does all fall under the banner of Belt and Road, certainly by geography and industry. And the Middle East is front and center of these opportunities, no different to Southeast Asia or other parts of the region.
How does that fit in? I mean, you talked about de-risking geopolitics at the beginning, and we've seen just in the last few days, you were just recently at the World Economic Forum event in Riyadh. Immediately after that, of course, there was a big American presence at WEF, as there always is, but the reemergence of the grand deal between Saudi Arabia and the United States that was pre the terrible events of October 7th and the subsequent invasion of Gaza, that this big deal between Saudi, Israel, and America, the US, was going to be the pillar of the new Middle East. Everybody sort of thought it was dead for now, but at least the US-Saudi part of that has reemerged as being in some advanced stage of agreement. And part of that, from an American-U.S. strategy point of view, would be to pull the Saudis out of the growing China orbit. And one of the points of intersection there around the world has been technology. You can't be Huawei and Microsoft or whatever the counter is to that. Huawei and 5G and all of the obstacles that has faced across the world due to the U.S. pressure. Where does that come into play in the Saudi deal with the US and this technology intersection between the Gulf and Asia and China? Can all of those things coexist, do you think, going forward?
Look, they can coexist. Saudi Arabia finds itself in a unique position, and as a non-aligned country, a partner of both China and the United States, and so equally is able to both take advantage of the best that either country will have to offer, and that sort of neutral positioning makes a good deal of sense, both commercially and politically. So there will be opportunities to both collaborate on both sides and to make the most of the technological advances of both China and the United States. There will be tricky moments, of course, but it is a unique position that the country or the kingdom and the rest of the GCC in the Middle East find itself in.
I mean, in terms of that, I mean, the historic nature of the old, whatever it's called, the Atlantic Basin Road, or between the Americas, Europe, and the Middle East and Saudi, of course, came with the very, very critical security blanket, security protection, if you like, and that underpins this new agreement, it would appear, with the US, if indeed it does get finally done. Is there ever an outlook, or is there anything that's in the new Silk Road and the new China, Middle East, Asia partnership that comes that could deliver security blanket, security sort of umbrella for the Gulf states in the way that the West and America has or promises to do? Or your thoughts on that as emerging as part of the new Silk Road structure?
So it's very unlikely that there will ever be a security element to it. It is primarily a commercial opportunity. There is, of course, bridge building taking place, both at the public and private level. So some of the events that you've just referenced, whether it's the Arab-China Business Summit, the World Economic Forum, these have been opportunities to bring together the private sector or policymakers from both sides to build bridges, relationships, the types of trust that are needed to take the whole project forward. But no real discussion of security, and it's unlikely going forward.
I mean, you'd have to say that one of the most significant geopolitical / security agreements in the last year was the deal between Saudi and Iran that was brokered by China, and sort of China was the midwife. And in many ways, that deal appears to have underpinned a lot of very, moments in the last year that could have gone into an uncertain place. But this rapprochement that China shepherded has maybe allowed everybody to remain on the same side of the street. How that is as a template for future China sort of role in the region?
So again, China as a non-aligned or neutral partner to all sides in the region can play more of a mediator role and may well have that ambition. We may see it more active. It was certainly hosting senior officials from the Middle East over the weekend with that purpose in mind. But nevertheless, it's important to recognize that China will follow its own template. It's not about to replicate what we've seen from either Europe or the United States over the last 10, 20, 50 years. China has a very different approach to the region, and it is one that puts commercial relations first, but equally is, of course, seeking to build those important bridges between cultures. So a different approach, but probably an important one for the region going forward.
And I mean, the same time frame, the 2 years coming out of COVID also, and this Iran Saudi sort of rapprochement also came at the same window of time as the resurgent BRICS, of which Saudi Arabia became a part of, and the UAE and Egypt, and of course that includes Russia and Brazil and India and China. I'm wondering, from your perspective, what role does that have going forward in this sort of greater growth and corridor of Asia, Middle East?
Look, Asia, Middle East combined are 40% of the global economy. There are, whether it's China, Japan, Korea, or UAE, Saudi Arabia.
Who, of course, aren't part of the BRICS, obviously, Korea and Japan.
No, but they all are very important. They all have very important roles to play within the new Silk Road region, both at a regional and a global level, and they will exert growing force over what the international landscape looks like, whether from a business or a political angle. And the region itself will continue to play an ever-growing and a more forceful role going forward. Where BRICS lies among that is more questionable. It's a very large range of geographically disparate countries, and so there will be plenty to agree on. There may well be plenty to disagree on.
I mean, you have the biggest oil suppliers in the world and the biggest oil consumers in the world in those few countries that make up the BRICS.
You certainly do, but there are many members that are not included as well. And so I would suggest that the BRICS itself is just one organization that may seek to sort of rewrite the rules or the global, or at least contribute to.
Do you see any real appetite in China for it to really get some sort of real structure and teeth, the BRICS? I mean, the reason I mentioned that Korea and Japan aren't in it, because obviously they're in the G7, and whether that is well, Japan in the G7, and whether the idea that the BRICS is some alternative parallel, competitor or alternative to the G7. But does the BRICS, and does China as kind of the biggest actor in the BRICS have any appetite to make it something comparable to the G7?
So there's appetite to make it more important. Whether you want to compare it to the effectiveness of the G7, I think it's not easy. It's a very different set of countries, very different share of GDP. There's again plenty for its members to agree on. There's also much to disagree on. So I think China will always have a preference to prioritize its bilateral relations, but of course will seek to make the most of multilateral bodies as well, such as the BRICS, where there is agreement. But it won't be the only multilateral body that it seeks to pursue or its interest or influence its business and political environment that it's operating in.
I mean, we've seen in the same period the G20 kind of come out through COVID as a major vehicle in which global agreements were done during the very turbulent COVID years. But coming out of COVID, we've had the recent hosting by Indonesia and India. How big of a framework is that now? We've seen these Asian countries emerge and seem to embrace the G20 as the kind of the global platform.
But I think the G20 provides them with a voice where the G7 doesn't. And what we've seen over the last 10, 20 years is the rise of middle powers, non-aligned forces that perhaps take a more neutral position. They're looking to exert their influence. They're able to do that more through a multilateral setting than they can bilaterally in most cases. And so the G20, of course, does become more important. But again, it would be wrong to overstate its influence, and we are moving towards a world where bilateral agreements perhaps are more important than we were in the past. Now, I think that's challenging at a global level, but the Asia-Middle East region is quite unique. We are still very committed to regionalization. We're home to 2 out of 3 of the world's world-class regional trade agreements. And so the flow of capital, talent, technology within our region is arguably stronger than it is anywhere else in the world. So while we don't, for now, have a multilateral body for just Asia, the Middle East, we are naturally the world's largest economic bloc, and we've become as ties between the regions grow over the next few years and decades.
We might just wrap up, Ben, just looking more immediately in the 2024 window and China, where China's going, GDP, macro, and so forth. We've kind of had a stumble out of COVID. I mean, that's been the general global narrative. It's been somewhat bearish China and China's emergence from COVID. From a global oil demand point of view, it's sort of been relatively flat to getting back to sort of pre-COVID levels, but not much beyond that. A quarter or third into 2024 and looking to the rest of 2024, how should the world think of China's post-COVID recovery?
So China is at an inflection point. It's now laying the foundations for long-term prosperity, and that means investing into the types of advanced industrial sectors, such as the clean energy sector, which will drive growth. But transitions are not means that short-term growth will be a little bit less robust, but it will lay the foundation for medium and long-term growth. So over the course of this year, we've seen a stabilization in manufacturing. We haven't quite seen the recovery in exports and real estate that over the last decade would have been traditional or more conventional growth drivers, but we are on track to hit growth.
But the opposite, just sorry to stop you and intervene there on the real estate side, never mind being growth factors. How big of a negative factor are they? I mean, is it just a neutral, or is it like the sort of outside view is that this is potentially a third of the economy that is not just neutral, it's actually potentially a big negative draw on the momentum of the Chinese economy?
So the real estate is a constraint on growth. It is, to your point, it is contracting. Sectors that supply the real estate industry, whether that's cement or steel, are all facing fairly weak conditions. So it's investments into new industries, such as, again, those clean energy sectors, which are providing an offsetting force. So again, this is an economy in transition, but it would be wrong to focus exclusively on the downside risks related to real estate without recognizing some of those upside risks, particularly the clean energy sectors, which do provide some sort of offsetting demand. So it's definitely more challenging, but it's an economy that's still growing at 5%, which is a decent rate. The question, of course, going forward too, will be the extent to which we can bring consumers or encourage consumers to spend at level and even to increase those levels going forward. So employment and income growth will be quite key over the medium term.
What about some big challenges vis-a-vis the likes of demographics, aging population of China, the whole structure and sort of challenges around big items like water and so forth. Are they drags on current growth?
So they are drags. The demographic challenge is well known. The youth population is in sharp decline. And so naturally, that's going to subtract from potential growth over the medium to long term. But equally, there's investments going into automation of factories. Industrial robotics is on the verge of a renaissance. It's a subject that you're probably going to hear a lot about over the coming years, particularly exports of industrial robotics. And that will help to solve some of the problems related to demographics, not entirely, but the government's well aware of this, and that's why there's so much effort going into looking for new sources of growth, but also recognition that we're not going to grow at the previous 10% rates. 5% is far more reasonable going forward.
I mean, it does. This 5% is massive, obviously, in any other OECD relative country, and the skepticism around what does actually 5% growth mean, and it's a target, obviously, that the Chinese government puts out at the beginning of the year, and everybody has to sharpen their darts and make sure they get to 5%. But I'm wondering, does it represent real new employment? Does it represent new, I mean, from our selfish self-interest, new oil demand, energy demand? Or is it a different type of 5% growth? I mean, typically 5% GDP growth of an economy the size of China would mean a lot of new oil barrel demand, but it doesn't.
Well, 2/3 of investment demand is into clean energy sectors. Nearly a third of GDP growth is into clean energy sectors. So we're talking arguably non-oil related sectors.
Yeah, but to build all of that stuff, you need a lot of oily hydrocarbon energy.
Yeah, you are right there, but nevertheless, it's a transition we're going through. So there will be, it's a slightly less oil intensive growth than it was in the past, but equally clean energy sources, everything, especially nuclear, for instance, are growing as a source of energy input as well. So I think the shape of the economy is changing. So again, 5% doesn't look like what 5% may have looked like five or 10 years ago. But the upside is that if you're looking for oil demand, well, 80% of the world, the globe's oil demand over the next sort of 5 years will come from the in general. So while we may not sell as many oil barrels in the past, that the energy ties between Asia and the Middle East are only going to intensify. And can I say, not just through the oil or conventional energy sectors, but particularly through clean energy sectors. And again, China is looking at the Middle East and its non-oil investments as a huge opportunity. And again, whether that's EV or battery storage, a range of products there that are possible commercial opportunities and collaboration between the two sides.
So it sounds from your tone and your commentary that the sort of bearish reviews that the Chinese post-COVID recovery has got and continues to get are a little over egging the pudding and maybe vested in some self-interest generally.
So there's still reason to be cautious about the outlook. There's still work to be done in terms of the short-term growth. We'd like to see a little bit more fiscal stimulus. We'd like to see greater support to consumers.
I mean, that's been a narrative for a while. Where is the fiscal stimulus? So we saw bionic stimulus in America in particular. That's why inflation is still such a problem, but not so much in China. It's sort of a counter irony, right? It's a communist country not doing stimulus, a capitalist country drowning people in stimulus. What's the hesitation in China? Is it just not an option anymore?
So there's perhaps lessons learned post-global financial crisis when the government spent too much, resulting in excess capacity, but also a rapid increase in debt. So there are lessons learned there. And also a recognition that it's the medium term that matters more than the short term at this point. Stimulus is fine so long as it's pushing you in the right direction. Again, those medium term goals of developing your more advanced industrial sectors. Where we would like to see a little bit more spending is providing a floor for low-income consumers. So it could be more spending on education, on maternity, on unemployment benefits. That would certainly give lower-income consumers more confidence to spend. We haven't seen that yet.
Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there. I could talk to Ben Simpfendorfer all day, but all we can do is 30 minutes at the max. And Ben Simpfendorfer of Oliver Wyman, thank you so much for your insights today.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.